Project 2025 900-page mandate for leadership, the mandate for leadership, the conservative promise. Paperback Live 4 with Adriane Mays, AI Genius. In this video with Adriane Mays, we're going to actually read the Project 2025 900-page mandate for leadership live, part 4. Parts 1, 2, and 3 you can catch live on at Adriane Mays for the uncut, unedited versions of no fluff, no interjections of any type of input of my mindset whatsoever about the Project 2025, but to provide this information for those to fight the Michigan literacy as well as Detroit. What up though? There's 47 or up to 50, almost 50% of people are illiterate. And so this 900-page mandate, the purpose of it being with CCC Because We Care Foundation, Random Acts of Kindness, virtual celebration September 11th, 2024, and being the president wanting to take and do a bespoke billionaire type of random acts of kindness started yesterday on Independence Day, providing the opportunity to hear and listen. And for those with unedited, you watch television and get the versions of other people. But here I'm just going to read the information that's provided free of charge. But again, it being 900 pages, some of it being intimidating by people, some people not wanting to dive into it. So what Adriane Mays is going to do is read the document to the totality, because when you start something, you have to finish it. And did the first 3 parts. And right now on page about 186. So on page 186, we'll dive right into, getting started with the Project 2025 900-page mandate for leadership. Those people that can't read it or don't have access to it now can just literally tune into live YouTube channel at Adriane Mays and hear what it's about, and then form your own opinion, and then go out in the media and base everything based on whatever you would like to base it on. So we left off, and we'll take another break here, in the midst of maybe around 4:30, 5 o'clock. But I'm going to try to get as much done as possible. The whole goal is to finish. So right now, on page 186 out of 922, and so we're talking about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So if there's any questions or anything that I missed, then please don't hesitate to join the community of cccwecaremi.com. and check it out in the comments. And if it's some value, share this with someone else that may need to have the education. Do that random acts of kindness. So the one challenge I provide for you is to provide some education to someone else that doesn't understand this Project 2025. As again, I appreciate Taraji P. Henson putting it out there during the BET Awards, opening up the conversation into the education of Adriane Mays, AI Genius, and literally in wealth creation, and being able to help and understand how transformation may happen and understanding the information that's out there. So that's all we're doing, is providing the information, unedited, uncut, no viewpoints on mine whatsoever. This is what's written and provided free of charge, but 900 pages, mandated for leadership if Donald Trump takes office in 2024. So you got to know what you're voting for, and I'm just helping out the process. Me, my random acts of kindness, Adriane Mays. It's got to be different, right? I think different. So Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, needed reforms. FEMA is the lead federal agency in preparing for and responding to disasters, but is overtasked, overcompensates for the lack of state and local preparedness and response, and is regularly in deep debt. After passage of the 1988 Stafford Act, the number of declared federal disasters rose dramatically as most disasters costs were shifted from states and local governments to the federal government. In addition, state-friendly FEMA regulations, such as per capita indicator, failed to maintain the pace of inflation and made it easy to meet disaster declaration thresholds. This combination has left FEMA unprepared in both readiness and funding for the truly catastrophic disasters in which its services are most needed. Reform of FEMA requires a greater emphasis on federalism and state and local preparedness, leaving FEMA to focus on large, widespread disasters. Under the Stafford Act, FEMA has the authority to adjust the per capita indicator for damages, which creates the threshold under which states and localities are not eligible for public assistance. FEMA should raise the threshold because the per capita indicator has not kept pace with inflation, and this over time has effectively lowered the threshold for public assistance and caused FEMA's resources to be stretched perilously thin. Alternatively, applying a deductible could accomplish a similar outcome while also incentivizing states to make a more proactive role in their own preparedness and response capabilities. In addition, Congress should change the cost share arrangement so that the federal government covers 25% of the costs for small disasters, with the cost share reaching a maximum of 75% for truly catastrophic disasters. FEMA is also responsible for the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, nearly all of which is issued by the federal government. Washington provides insurance at prices lower than the actuarially fair rates, thereby subsidizing flood insurance. Then, when flood costs exceed NFIP's revenue, FEMA seeks taxpayer-funded bailouts. Current NFIP debt is $20.5 billion, and in 2017, Congress canceled $16 billion in debt when FEMA reached its borrowing authority limit. These subsidies and bailouts only encourage more development in flood zones, increasing the potential loss to both NFIP and the taxpayer. The NFIP should be wound down and repaired with private insurance, starting with the least risky areas currently identified by the program. Budget issues. FEMA manages all grants for DHS, and these grants have become pork for states, localities, and special interest groups. Since 2002, DHS, FEMA have provided more than $56 billion in preparedness grants for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. For fiscal year 2023, President Biden requested more than $3.5 billion for federal assistance grants. Funds provided under these programs do not provide measurable gains for preparedness or resiliency. Rather, more than any objective needs, political interests appear to direct the flow of non-disaster funds. The principles of federalism should be upheld. These indicate that states better understand their unique needs and should bear the cost of their particularized programs. FEMA employees in Washington, D.C. should not determine how billions of federal tax dollars should be awarded to train local law enforcement officers in Texas, harden cybersecurity infrastructure in Utah, or supplement migrant shelters in Arizona. DHS should not be in the business of handling out federal tax dollars. These grants should be terminated. Accomplishing this, however, will require action by members of Congress who repeatedly vote to fund grants for political reasons. The transition should focus on building resilience and return on investments in line with real threats. Personnel. FEMA currently has 4 Senate-confirmed positions. Only the administrators should be confirmed by the Senate. Other political leadership should not be confirmed by the Senate. Additionally, FEMA's swinging cabinet position should be eliminated, as this creates significant unnecessary challenges to the functioning of the whole of DHS at points in time when coordinated responses are most needed. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, needed reforms. CISA is supposed to have 2 key roles. Number 1, protection of the federal civilian government networks, .gov, while coordinating the execution of national cyber defense and sharing information with non-federal and private sector partners. And 2, national coordination of critical infrastructure security and resilience. Yet CISA has rapidly expanded its scope into lanes where it does not belong, the most recent and most glaring example being censorship of so-called misinformation and disinformation. CISA's funding and resources should align nearly with the foregoing 2 mission requirements. The components emergency communications and chemical facility anti-terrorism standards, CFATS, roles should be moved to FEMA. Its school security function should be transferred to state homeland security offices, and CISA should refrain from duplicating cybersecurity functions done elsewhere at the Department of Defense, FBI, National Security Agency, and U.S. Secret Service. Of the utmost urgency is immediately ending CISA's counter disinformation efforts. The federal government cannot be the arbitrator of truth. CISA began this work because of alleged Russian misinformation in the 2016 election, which in fact turned out to be a Clinton campaign dirty trick. The intelligence community, including the NSA or DoD, should counter foreign actors. At the time of this writing, release of the Twitter files has demonstrated that CISA has devolved it into an unconstitutional censoring and election engineering apparatus of the political left. In any event, the entirety of the CISA Cybersecurity Advisory Committee should be dismissed on day one. For election security, CISA should help states and localities assess whether they have good cyber hygiene in their hardware and software in preparation for an election, but nothing more. This of value to smaller localities, particularly by flagging who is attacking their website. CISA should not be significantly involved closer to an election, nor should it participate in messaging or propaganda. U.S. Coast Guard, USCG. Needed reforms. The U.S. Coast Guard fleet should be sized to the needs of great power competition, specifically focusing efforts and investment on protecting U.S. waters, all while seeking to find, where feasible, more economical ways to perform USCG missions. The scope of the Coast Guard's mission needs to be focused on protecting U.S. resources and interests in its home waters, specifically its exclusive economic zone, 200 miles from shore. USCG's budget should address the growing demand for it to address the increasing threat from the Chinese fishing fleet in home waters, as well as narcotics and migrant flows in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Doing this will require reversing years of shortfalls in shipbuilding, maintenance, and upgrades of shore facilities, as well as seeking more cost-effective shipping facility designs. In wartime, the USCG supports the Navy, but it has limited capability and capacity to support wartime missions outside home waters. New policies. The Coast Guard's mission should be scaled down to match congressional budgeting in the long term, with any increased funding going to acquisitions based on an updated fleet mix analysis. The current shipbuilding plan is insufficient based on USCG analysis, and the necessary numbers of planned offshore patrol cutters and national security cutters are not supported by congressional budgets. The Coast Guard should be required to submit to Congress a long-range shipbuilding plan modeled on the Navy's 30-year shipbuilding plan. Ideally, this should become part of the Navy plan in a new comprehensive naval long-range shipbuilding plan to ensure better coherency in the services requirements. Outside of home waters and following the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, the Coast Guard should prioritize limited resources to the nation's expansive Pacific waters to counter growing Chinese influence and encroachment. Expansion of facilities in American Samoa and basing of cutters there is one clear step in this direction and should be accelerated, looking to free association states, Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands for enhanced and persistent presence, assuming adequate congressional funding as another such step. The Secretary of the Navy should convene a naval board to review and reset requirements for Coast Guard wartime mission support. To inform and validate these updated requirements, the Chief of Naval Operations and the Coast Guard Commandant should execute dedicated annual joint wartime drills focused on USCG's wartime missions in the Pacific. The money for these activities should be allocated from DoD. An interagency maritime coordination office focused on developing and overseeing comprehensive efforts to advance the nation's maritime efforts, interests, and increase its military and commercial competitiveness should be established. Given the USCG's history of underfunded missions, if the Coast Guard is to continue to maintain the Arctic mission, money to do so will be required over and above current funding levels. Consideration should be given to shifting the Arctic mission to the Navy. Either way, the Arctic mission should be closely coordinated with our Canadian, Danish, and other allies. Personnel. USCG is facing recruitment challenges similar to those faced by the military services. The administration should stop the messaging on wokeness and diversity and focus instead on attracting the best talent for USCG. Simultaneously, consistent with the Department of Defense, USCG should also make a serious effort to revet any promotions and hiring that occurred on the Biden administration's watch, while also re-onboarding in any USCG personnel who are dismissed from service for refusing to take the COVID-19 vaccine, with time and service credited to such returnees. These two steps could be foundational for any improvements in the recruiting process. U.S. Secret Service, USSS, needed reforms. The U.S. Secret Service must be the world's best protective agency. Currently, the agency is distracted by its dual mission of protection and financial investigations. The result has been a long series of high-profile embarrassments and security failures, perhaps most notably, it's allowing a then Vice President-elect Kamala Harris to be inside the Democratic National Committee office on January 6, 2021, while a pipe bomb was outside. Despite the great size and scope of the January 6 investigation, this high-profile incident of danger to a protectee remains unresolved. The failures of the USSS protective mission are too numerous to list here. A December 2015 bipartisan report from the House Oversight Committee listed dozens of such incidents as well as needed recommendations for reform. This chapter adopts those findings and recommendations in whole, especially the finding that USSS dual mission structure detracts from the agency's protective capabilities. At the time of that report, USSS agents spent only 1/3 of their work hours on protection-related activities as opposed to investigative activities. USSS was established initially to investigate counterfeit currency, but its mission has evolved over the decades to prioritize electronic financial crimes. For example, as this chapter was being written, all 15 of USSS most wanted individuals were wanted for financial crimes, many of them international in nature. Notably, the last head of the agency left not for a protection-related job, but to be the chief security officer of social media company Snapchat. This is a pattern that has developed over the years, with agents seeking to burnish their online financial crimes credentials to secure corporate security jobs. Coupled with some of the lowest morale in the federal government, the agency has completely lost sight of the primacy of its protective mission. New policies. USSS should transfer to the Department of Justice and Department of Treasury all investigations that are not related to its protective function. It should begin the logistical operation of closing all field offices throughout the country and internationally to the extent they are not taken over by Treasury or Justice. USSS agents stationed outside of Washington, D.C. should be transferred to work in immigration and customs enforcement field offices, where they will continue to be the boots on the ground to follow up on threat reports throughout the country and liaise with local law enforcement for visits by protectees. Page 158 and page 191 out of 922. The only investigations not related to USSS protective function that agents should pursue will be directed by HSI and relate to tracking the financial crimes associated with illegal immigration. This should include tracing remittances, any funds that are used to pay coyotes or the cartels, and payments by businesses to illegal aliens and all other crimes associated with illegal immigration. USSS should keep visitor logs for all facilities where the president works or resides. The Biden administration has evaded such transparency, with President Biden spending a historic amount of time for a president at his Delaware residence. This has left the American people in the dark as to who is influencing the highest levels of their own government. Budget. The suggested reforms will result in a significant USSS budget reduction, primarily because the agency will relinquish dozens of physical offices throughout the US and internationally. Some amount of savings should be used to fix the personnel problems and for recruitment initiatives aimed at individuals who are inclined to join a protection focused agency. Personnel. As documented extensively in the above recreational report, low morale and high turnover are key drivers of USSS problems. With their mission focused on protection, agents will no longer spend the bulk of their time developing unrelated skill sets. Instead, USSS agents could hone their protection skills and pursue a protection career path in the agency rather than quickly leaving USSS for high paying corporate security jobs. The Uniform Division UD of USSS requires a significant staffing increase. As documented in the bipartisan report, understaffing results in unpredictable and long hours, which in turn results in high turnover, which only compounds the problem. Another key issue is that UD officers lack the ability to enforce criminal laws outside the immediate vicinity of the White House. As the District of Columbia is a federal jurisdiction and currently is beholden to the trend of progressive pro-crime policies, UD officers should enforce all applicable laws. The result will be to allow UD officers to gain more law enforcement experience and attractive credential that would improve morale. Transportation Security Administration, TSA. The TSA model is costly and unwisely makes TSA both the regulatory and the regulated organization responsible for screening operations. As part of an effort to shrink federal bureaucracies and bring private sector know-how to government programs, TSA is a ripe for reform. The US should look to the Canadian and European private models of providing aviation screening manpower to lower TSA costs while maintaining security. Until it's privatized, TSA should be treated as a national security provider and its workforce should be deunionized immediately. TSA could privatize the screening function by expanding the current screening partnership program, SPP, to all airports. TSA would turn screening operations over to airports that would choose security contractors that meet TSA regulations and would oversee and test airports for compliance. Alternatively, it could adopt a Canadian-style system, turning over screening operations to a new government corporation that contracts screening service to private contractors. Contractors would bid to provide their services to a set of airports in a particular region, likely with around 10 regions nationally. TSA would continue to set security regulations and test airports for compliance, and the new corporation would establish any operating procedures or customer service standards. With either model, the intelligence function for domestic travel patterns should remain with the US government. The federal government could expect to save 15% to 20% from the existing aviation screening budget, but savings could be significantly larger. Service to travelers should also improve. Management Directorate, MGMT. The Management Directorate is unnecessarily large because each individual component also maintains its own respective management office. Too much overlap and red tape exists between headquarters, HQ, and components with regard to such functions as hiring, information technology, and procurement. Finance is unique. Finance is unique given that HQ needs to address reprogramming and component budgets need to roll up into all department budgets. The Directorate requires intense reform, the specifics of which should be further assessed given its expansive nature. Front office, FO. Immediately place a small team of advisors with a deep understanding of operational management, but who have some experience in government because they will need to understand the nuance of reduction in force, RIF, appropriations, hurdles when dealing with US government reorganization, etc. To sit in the MGMTFO reporting to the secretary, ultimately either S1 or S2, one of these advisors should understand US government employment law and be prepared to relocate personnel and downside offices accordingly. This includes reverting to the original understanding of the function of individuals appointed to the senior executive service, competent managers who can work capably with any subject matter in any location. Over the next few months of the administration, the advisor's role should be to assess what structural and procedural changes are appropriate. They should dissect the current standing management directives and the approval processes in place to implement and or change them. Office of the Chief Human Capital Officers, processes and procedures hurdles to the Office of Chief Procurement Officers, procurement of innovative technology and the facilities plan, including the consolidation into the St. Elizabeth campus. They should also be prepared to help implement any end to unionization of DHS components in response to an executive order pursuant to 5 USC 7103. Office of the Chief Financial Officer, OFCO. DHS responsibilities work with Congress and have been split between the Office of Legislative Affairs, OLA, and OCFO. OLA deals with the authorizing committees on policy issues, and OCFO works with the appropriations committees on budget planning, execution, and reprogramming. This split creates communication and visibility issues within DHS and inconsistency in answers to Congress. This is an issue not only within the HQ model, but also throughout the components. Either appropriations personnel should be moved to OLA, and there should be a dotted line reporting structure to OCFO, or a policy that OLA personnel must be included on communication to Congress should be implemented. To avoid answer shopping by congressional staff, particularly appropriations, staff all budget communications from the OCFO, including from the CFO herself, should first be provided to the director of OLA to ensure consistency of information, messaging, and answers. This may be deemed awkward given that the OCFO is a Senate-confirmed position, but is necessary to avoid inaccuracies and inconsistencies in messaging. Federal Protective Service, FPS. FPS needs federal agents to develop, share, and receive operational information and maintain direct contact with the Secretary in the midst of heightened threats. Before the summer 2020, civil unrest positioning FPS under MGMT was justified, but given the current climate, they should not be reporting through MGMT. This may be especially problematic if a management directorate under security lacking law enforcement or military experience is in place when a situation like summer 2020 arises. FPS should report to the Secretary as other components, for example, FLETC do. This would add little to the Secretary's current burden unless or until civil unrest arises, at which point reporting to the Secretary creates a direct line between the primary DHS decision maker, S1 or S2, and the FPS director. Regarding operational communication, there should be information sharing mandates, MOAs, which are applicable under specific circumstances where federal facilities are involved. Between FPS and the U.S. Marshals, U.S. Park Police, and FBI, agreements with U.S. Capitol Police and Supreme Court Police should also be considered, but it's noteworthy that those entities are jurisdictionally outside of the executive branch. Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans, PLCY. Department level reforms, PLCY, should perform a complete inventory, analysis, and reevaluation of the department's domestic terrorism lines of effort to ensure that they are consistent with the president's priorities, congressional authorization, and Americans' constitutional rights. PLCY should likewise do a complete inventory, analysis, and evaluation of any other department's works in coordination with social media outlets to censor or otherwise change or affect American speech. PLCY should comprehensively report on and publish this history in full so that American people can know the facts. The department should remove all personnel who participated in any of this activity. The department has significant authority and budget to provide grants for various purposes. This effort is diffused across components and lacks central policy, thoughts, and coordination. PLCY should set a department wide policy that establishes how granting choices are to be made and is consistent with the president's priorities. PLCY should clear all granting decisions to ensure that they are consistent with the new policy. PLCY wide reforms. PLCY would work with Congress to streamline the department's reporting requirements. Because there has not been a departmental reauthorization bill, and these requirements have been added piecemeal over 2 decades, they significantly overlap and even conflict, wasting resources and distracting from the department's mission. PLCY should seek the elimination of the quadrennial Homeland Security Review. Issue area reforms. PLCY should bolster its immigration statistics program and make it the one-stop shop for the timely production of all department immigration statistics and analysis. Office of Intelligence and Analysis, INA. The Office of Intelligence Analysis should be eliminated both because it has not added value and because it has been weaponized for domestic political purposes. The intelligence community, IC, already provides raw intelligence to DHS components. In addition, the FBI, National Counterterrorism Center, and other agencies where necessary already provide holistic threat assessment for products to federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, as well as to private sector entities at both the classified and unclassified levels where appropriate. IA&As work as an interlocutor between the IC and DHS components, individual intelligence operations on the one hand, and government and the private sector on the other, as well as between the IC and the components is at best duplicative. At worst, it is used and discussed in the media as a political tool, resulting in more harm than good to the US government and IC writ large. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is not a member of the IC, should create cyber intelligence products in a collaborative fashion with the National Security Agency and US Cyber Command. Such efforts would lead to timelier, usable, classified and unclassified products for stakeholders that exceed the quality and capability of INA's efforts. This same principle applies to other components as well. CPB, TSA, etc. All have their own intelligence operations and are better situated with their subject matter experts to make their own assessments. The National Operations Center, NOC, within the Office of Operations Coordination, OPS, should absorb those select INA functions and tactically proficient personnel that need to be maintained. For example, technical support to the National Vetting Center. The remainder of the INA should be eliminated. The OPS entity should maintain IC status, and the only intelligence mission set should be to provide situational awareness and the dissemination of operational information or raw intelligence, no analysis or products, at classified and unclassified levels to executive leadership across the department, not outside of DHS. Office of the General Counsel, OGC, needed reforms. OGC should advise principals as to how DHS can execute its missions within the law instead of advising principals as to why they cannot execute regulations, policies, and programs. Instead of each component's chief counsel reporting to the headquarters general counsel with a solid line and indirectly to his or her component head with a dotted line, the accountability should be reversed. Due to the different missions throughout the department, the components can better manage the legal issues of their specific mission than headquarters can. Thus, the chief counsel or equivalent of each component should report directly to the component head, report indirectly to the DHS general counsel, and be accountable to the component head. The report to the General Counsel is to ensure consistency of advice across DHS. OGC should hire significantly more Schedule C political appointees who in turn supervise career staff and manage their output. DHS's mission is politically charged, and the legal function cannot be allowed to thwart the administration's agenda by providing stilted or erroneous legal positions and decision making. OGC should serve as the center of the response to legal challenges facing the department to ensure a streamlined, consistent response to a litany of issues facing the department. It is important to ensure consistency across all potential legal positions taken by the department, including those arising in litigation, congressional oversight, and inquiries received from the Inspector General, U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, and Congressional Research Service, and pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act. OGC should invest in e-discovery software and can contract with a vendor to manage the department's e-discovery. This should be beneficial both in litigation and in responding to congressional oversight. Removing delays in e-discovery processing would also reduce the issues of subpoena in the department and the generation of negative press for the administration that comes from delayed responses. The old practices of relying on executive secretary taskings to pull documents for congressional requests does not work. It is slow, the metrics for what documents are gathered and how are unclear, and the components do not gather responsive material in an efficient manner. Document gathering should come from the Office of Chief Information Officer or a relevant technological element within the department that can pull responsive communications quickly. Office of Legislative Affairs, OLA, Office or of Public Affairs, OPA, and Office of Partnership and Engagement, and OPE. DHS's external communications function should be consolidated and reformed so that the president's agenda can be implemented more effectively. The Office of Partnership and Engagement should be merged into the Office of Public Affairs. In many cabinet agencies, outreach to companies and partner organizations is similarly performed by the Office of Public Affairs. This would also accomplish a needed DHS organizational and management reform to decrease the number of direct reports to the secretary. Both public and legislative affairs staff in the components should report directly to their respective headquarters equivalently. This would help to avoid a failure by the department to speak with one voice. It would also allow the component staff to perform more efficiently, overseen by expert managers in their trade. This would also allow DHS to respond to crisis effectively by shifting staff as needed to the most pressing issues and better use underutilized staff at less active components. Only political appointees and OLA should interact directly with congressional staff on all inquiries, including budget and appropriations matters. To prevent congressional staff from answer shopping among HQ, OLA, the DHS, OCFO, and components, DHS Legislative Affairs, Appropriations, staff should be moved from MGMT, OCFO into OLA. Regarding components, budget appropriations, and staff should move from component budget offices into component legislative affairs offices. Because dozens of congressional committees and subcommittees either have or claim to have jurisdiction over some DHS function, DHS staff from the secretary on down spend so much time responding to congressional hearing and briefing requests, letters, and questions for the record that they are left with little time to do their assigned job of protecting the homeland. The next president should reach an agreement with congressional leadership to limit committee jurisdiction to one authorizing committee and one appropriations committee in each chamber. If congressional leadership will not limit their committees jurisdiction over DHS should identify one authorizing and appropriations committee in each chamber and answer only to it. To focus more precisely on the DHS mission, OLA staff should also identify outdated and needless congressional reporting requirements and notify Congress that DHS will cease reporting on such matters. For other congressional reports, OLA should implement a sunset date so that Congress must regularly demonstrate at the need for specific data. In both OPA and OLA, a change in mission and culture is needed. The clients of both components are the president and the secretary, not the media, external organizations, or Congress. OPA and OLA should change from being compliance correspondents for outside entities airing grievances to serving as messengers and advocates for the president and the secretary. Office of Operations Coordination, OPS. OPS was originally conceived by then Secretary Jay Johnson as an entity tasked with coordinating cross-DHS assets on an as-needed basis using a joint operations approach. This role is particularly challenging because of the disparate nature of mission sets across DHS. OPS should absorb a very small number of technical intelligence professionals from INAs as the result of INA is shut down. Such intelligence officers should be a subordinate element within OPS placed within the National Operations Center. The intelligence officers would provide tactical intelligence support for upcoming or ongoing operations in addition to liaising with their agency component counterparts. There will be no strategic intelligence analysis done as part of OPS or its new INA sub-element. In addition to facilitating all of DHS coordination on a task-by-task basis, OPS would be responsible for ongoing situational awareness for the secretary and deputy secretary. In addition to long-term staffing, OPS would have cycling billets from each of the major agencies and components to facilitate its most effective working relationships across DHS. Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, CRCL, and Privacy Office, PRIV. The Homeland Security Act established only an officer of CRCL, not an office. The only substantive function Congress then assigned to the officer was to review and assess information alleging abuses of civil rights. Since then, Congress and CRCL itself have significantly expanded CRCL's scope and size well beyond its original intent or helpful purpose. CRCL now operates and views itself as a quasi DHS Office of Inspector General. This results in a considerable waste of limited component resources, which are routinely tasked to address redundant, overly burdensome, and uninformed demands from CRCL. It is therefore important to recalibrate CRCL's scope and reach. The organizational structure of both CRCL and the Privacy Office should be changed to ensure proper alignment with the department's mission. The Office of General Counsel should absorb both CRCL's and PRIV's necessary functions and staff. Although the CRCL officer and the Freedom of Information Act, the FOIA, Privacy Officer are statutory, their offices are not mandatory. CRCL and PRIV officers and employees should report to a Deputy General Counsel who would be a political appointee. The CRCL officer should focus on equal employment opportunity, EEO, compliance and the civil liberties function and the investigative matters only within headquarters or support components. Operational components, civil liberties officers should investigate incidents regarding their own agencies. The CRCL officer should ensure that all civil liberties or civil rights complaints are sent to the Office of Inspector General, OIG, for review. If the OIG chooses not to investigate, the CRCL officer should only provide supportive information on possible courses of action for complainants. The PRIV officer and FOIA officers should focus on FOIA privacy compliance, privacy, and privacy incidents response. The Deputy General Counsel should provide guidance to DHS leadership regarding privacy compliance and privacy incident response to ensure that only U.S. persons and lawful permanent residents are provided protections as required by the Privacy Act. All DHS issuance should be updated to reflect that DHS protects the privacy of individuals as required by the Privacy Act, U.S. persons and lawful permanent residents, the Judicial Redress Act of 2015, and any U.S. European Union Data Protection and Privacy Agreement. Because of the lack of public trust in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, CRCL and PRIV staff should no longer review intelligence products or provide guidance on any intelligence products or reports. A consistent, clear, and singular message is necessary for DHS's mission. Therefore, all communication and/or meetings with any federal, state, local, or non-governmental groups should be limited to the Deputy General Counsel. In addition, given the narrower scope of work, OGC should disband the outside advisory boards and the more than 50 working groups in which CRCL and PRIV currently participate. Finally, CRCL and PRIV should no longer issue bulletins or periodicals. Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman, OIDO, and Office of the Citizenship and Immigration Services Ombudsman, CISOMB. OIDO. The Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman should be eliminated. This requires a statutory change in Section 106 of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2020. OIDO was designed to create another impediment to detention, thorough and additional layer of so-called oversight. Several agencies already perform detention oversight. ICE conducts internal audits of facilities and investigates complaints against ICE agents through the Office of Professional Responsibility. Similarly, CBP accepts individual complaints regarding facilities through the Joint Intake Center. It manages complaints against agents through the OPR. In addition, CRCL, OIG, GAO, and Congress all perform detention oversight. These multiple bodies place unmanageable and unreasonable burdens on ICE to manage several sometimes inconsistent audits, inspections at the same time. If OIDO remains a DHS component, the Secretary should immediately issue a directive stripping CRCL of its immigration portfolio. OIDO is in a better position with dedicated resources and immigration experts to perform this function than CRCL is. Allowing both offices to conduct detention oversight is duplicative and wasteful. The Secretary should conduct a thorough review of the effectiveness of Directive 0810.1, which is widely interpreted as requiring a wholesale referral of cases to OIG. In reality, OIG investigates only a small fraction of them and often sits on cases for longer than the 5-day window specified in the directive. Meanwhile, the other agencies wait in limbo to execute their duties. CISOMB. The Office of the Citizenship and Immigration Services Ombudsman should be eliminated. The DHS bureaucracy is too large, and the Secretary has too many direct reports. CISOMB's policy functions can be performed, and sometimes already are, by OIG and GAO. The specialized casework can be moved into USCIS as a special unit, much like the IRS taxpayer advocate. This will require a statutory change to Section 452 of the Homeland Security Act of 2002. If CIS-OMB continues as a DHS component, a policy should be issued that prohibits CIS-OMB from assisting illegal aliens to obtain benefits. Currently, approximately 15 to 20% of CIS-OMB's workload consists of helping DACA applicants obtain and renew benefits, including work authorization. This is not the role of an ombudsman. In addition, the government should be a neutral adjudicator, not an advocate for illegal aliens. Agency relationships. It is critical to the achievement of the president's policy objectives that all agencies and all departments touching immigration policy work in sync with one another. While there are numerous areas in which cooperation is critical, immigration has proven to be the most difficult. Accordingly, several objectives will be necessary for each of the following departments. The Department of Health and Human Services agreed to move the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, to DHS, or alternatively implement an aggressively and regular effort by the Secretary of HHS to ensure that ORR is fully pursuing presidential objectives in support of DHS. Department of Defense, assist in aggressively building the border wall system on America's southern border. Additionally, explicitly acknowledge and adjust personnel and priorities to participate actively in the defense of America's borders, including using military personnel and hardware to prevent illegal crossings between ports of entry and channel all across border traffic to legal ports of entry. Department of Justice agreed to move the executive order for immigration review and the Office of Immigration Litigation to DHS, and or alternatively to treat the administrative law judges, immigration judges, and Board of Immigration Appeals as nationally security personnel, decertify their union, and move to increase hiring significantly to enable the processing of more immigration cases. Department of State, allow DHS to lead international engagement in the Western Hemisphere on issues of security and migration. Additionally, quickly and aggressively address recalcitrant countries' failure to accept deportees by imposing stiff sanctions until deportees are in fact accepted for return, not just promised to be taken. Department of Housing and Urban Development, ensure that only U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents utilize or occupy federally subsidized housing. Department of Education, deny loan access to those who are not U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents, and deny loan access to students at schools that provide in-state tuition to illegal aliens. Department of Labor, eliminate the 2 of 4 lowest wage levels of foreign workers. Department of the Treasury, implement all necessary regulations both to equalize taxes between American citizens and working visa holders, and to provide DHS with all tax information of illegal aliens as expeditiously as possible. Intelligence community, cooperate in the shrinking or elimination of the INA role in the IC while replacing it with CPB, CBP, and HSI representation to the IC. And then we have the end notes, and we are on page 167 and page 201, yay, out of 922 of the PDF. And so now we are on part 6, chapter 6, which is Department of State, Ron K. Skinner. The U.S. Department of State's mission is to bilaterally, multilaterally, and regionally implement the president's foreign policy priorities to serve U.S. citizens abroad and to advance the economic, foreign policy, and national security interests of the United States. Since the U.S. founding, the Department of State has been the American government's designated tool of engagement with foreign governments and peoples throughout the world. Country names, borders, leaders, technology, and people have changed in the more than 2 centuries since the founding, but the basis of diplomacy remained the same. Although the department has also evolved throughout the years, at least in the modern era, there is one significant problem that the next president must address to be successful. There are scores of fine diplomats who serve the president's agenda, often helping to shape and interpret that agenda. At the same time, however, in all administration, there's a tug of war between presidents and bureaucracies, and that resistance is much starker under conservative presidents, due largely to the fact that large swaths of the State Department's workforce are left wing and predisposed to disagree with the conservative president's policy agenda and vision. It should not and cannot be this way. The American people need and deserve a diplomatic machine fully focused on the national interest as defined through the election of a president who sets the domestic international agenda for the nation. The next administration must take swift and decisive steps to reforge the department into a lean and functional diplomatic machine that serves the president and thereby the American people. Below is the basic but essential roadmap for achieving those repairs. History and context. Founded in 1789, the Department of State was one of the first cabinet level agencies in the new American government. The first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, oversaw a small staff diplomatic post in London and Paris and 10 consular posts. Today, the Department of State has almost 80,000 total employees, including 13,517 foreign service employees and 11,683 civil service employees in 275 embassies, consulates, and other posts around the world. In theory, the State Department is the principal agency responsible for carrying out the president's foreign policy and representing the United States and other nations and international organizations. To the extent consistent with presidential policy and federal law, the department also supports U.S. citizens and businesses in other nations and vets foreign nationals seeking temporary or permanent interest to the United States. The State Department also provides humanitarian, security, and other assistance to non-U.S. populations in need and otherwise advances and supports U.S. national interests abroad. Properly led, the State Department can be instrumental for communicating and implementing a foreign policy vision that best serves American citizens. As the U.S. Commission on National Security, 21st Century, the Hart-Rudman Commission, observed more than 20 years ago, the State Department is a crippled institution suffering from an ineffective organizational structure in which regional and functional policies do not serve integrated goals, in which sound management, accountability, and leadership are lacking. Unfortunately, this critique remains accurate. The State Department failures are not due to a lack of resources. As one expert has observed, that the department has significantly more at its disposal than was the case at the end of the Cold War in the mid-1990s and at the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. A major source, if not the major source, of the State Department's ineffectiveness lies in its institutional belief that it is an independent institution that knows what is best for the United States, sets its own foreign policy, and does not need direction from an elected president. The next president can make the State Department more effective by providing a clear foreign policy vision, selecting political officials and career diplomats that will enthusiastically turn that vision into a policy agenda, and firmly supporting the State Department as it makes the necessary institutional adjustments. Political leadership and bureaucratic leadership and support. Focusing the State Department on the needs and goals of the next president will require the president's handpicked political leadership, as well as foreign service and civil service personnel who share the president's vision and policy agendas to run the department. This can be done by taking the steps at the outset of the next administration. Exert leverage during the confirmation process. Notwithstanding the challenges and slowness of the modern U.S. Senate confirmation process, the next president can exert leverage on the Senate if he or she is willing to place State Department appointees directly into those roles pending confirmation. Doing so would both ensure that the department has immediate senior political leadership and would force the Senate to act on a nominee's appointments instead of being allowed to engage in dilatory tactics that cripple the State Department's functionality for weeks, months, or even years. Assert leadership in the appointment process. The next administration should assert leadership over and guidance to the State Department by placing political appointees in positions that do not require Senate confirmation, including senior advisors, principal deputy assistant secretaries, and deputy assistant secretaries. Given the department's size, the next administration should also increase the number of political appointees to manage it. To the extent possible, all non-confirmed senior appointees should be selected by the president-elect's transition team or the new president's office of presidential personnel, depending on the timing of selection, and be in place the first day of the administration. No one in a leadership position on the morning of January 20th should hold that position at the end of the day. These recommendations do not imply that foreign service and civil service officials should be excluded from key roles. It is hard to imagine a scenario in which they are not immediately relevant to the transition of power. The main suggestion here is that as many political appointees as possible should be in place at the start of a new administration. Support and train political appointees. The Secretary of State should use his or her office and its resources to ensure regular coordination among all political appointees, which should take the form of strategy meetings, trainings, and other events. The Secretary should also take reasonable steps to ensure that the State Department's political appointees are connected to other departments' political appointees, which is critical for cross-agency effectiveness and morale. The Secretary should capitalize on the more experienced political appointees by using them as the foundation for a mentorship program for less experienced political appointees. The interaction of political appointees must be routine and operational rather than the incidental or occasional, and it must be treated as a crucial dimension for the next administration's success. Maximize the value of career officials. Career foreign service and civil service personnel can and must be leveraged for their expertise and commitment to the president's mission. Indeed, the State Department has thousands of employees with unparalleled linguistics, cultural, policy, and administrative skills, and large numbers of them have been an enormous resource to the secretaries of state under which they have served. The secretary must find a way to make clear to career officials that despite prior history and modes of operation, they need not be adversaries of a conservative president, secretary of state, or the team of political appointees. Reboot ambassadors worldwide. All ambassadors are required to submit letters of resignation at the start of a new administration. Previous Republican administrations have accepted the resignations of only the political ambassadors and allowed the foreign service ambassadors to retain their posts, sometimes for months or years into a new administration. The new administration must go further. It should go both accept the resignations of all political ambassadors and quickly review and reassess all career ambassadors. This review should commence well before the new administration's first day. Ambassadors in new countries where U.S. policy or posture would substantially change under the new administration, as well as any who have evinced hostility toward the incoming administration or its agenda, should be recalled immediately. The priority should be to put in place new ambassadors who support the president's agenda among political appointees, foreign service officers, and civil service personnel with no predetermined percentage among these categories. Political ambassadors with strong personnel relationships with the president should be prioritized for key strategic posts such as Australia, Japan, the United Kingdom, the United Nations, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Righting the ship. Ensuring the State Department is accountable for serving American citizens first will require at a minimum that following steps be implemented immediately. Review retroactively. Before inauguration, the President-elect's Department transition team should assess every aspect of State Department negotiations and funding commitments. Upon inauguration, the Secretary of State should order an immediate freeze on all efforts to implement unratified treaties and international agreements, allocation of resources, foreign assistance disbursements, domestic and international contracts, and payments, hiring and recruiting decisions, etc., pending a political appointee-driven review to ensure that such efforts comport with the new administration's policies. The quality of this review is more important than speed. The posture of the department during this review should be an unwavering desire to prioritize the American people, including a recognition that the federal government must be a diligent steward of taxpayer dollars. Implement repair. The State Department must change its handling of international agreements to restore constitutional governance. Under prior administrations, unnecessary institutional factors in the department caused numerous logistical challenges in negotiating, approving, and implementing treaties and agreements. This is particularly true under the Biden administration. For example, under the Biden administration, the State Department was considered sufficiently unreliable in terms of alignment and effectiveness such that its political leadership invoked its Circular 175, C-175 authority to delegate its diplomatic capacity to other agencies, such as the Department of Homeland Security. At time of publication, the State Department is negotiating or seeking to negotiate large-scale sovereignty eroding agreements that could come at considerable economic and other costs to the American people. Although such agreements should be evaluated and approved as our treaties, the Biden administration is likely to simply call them agreements. The Biden State Department not only approves, but also enforces treaties that have not ratified by the U.S. Senate. This practice must be thoroughly reviewed and must likely just jettisoned. The next president should recalibrate how the State Department handles treaties and agreements, primarily by restoring constitutionally to these processes. He or she should direct the Secretary of State to freeze any ongoing treaty or international agreement negotiations and assess whether those efforts align with the new president's foreign policy direction. The next administration should also direct the Secretary to order an immediate stand down on enforcement of any treaties that have not been ratified by the Senate and order a thorough review of the degree to which such enforcement has impacted the department's functions, policies, and use of resources. The Secretary of State, in cooperation with the policy of the Attorney General and the White House Counsel's Office, should also conduct a review to identify agreements that are really treaty commitments within the ordinary public meaning of the Constitution, and suspend compliance pending presidential transmittal of those agreements to the Senate for advice and consents. The next administration should also move to withdraw from treaties that have been under Senate consideration for 20 years or more, with the understanding that those treaties are unlikely to be ratified. Under circumstances in which ratification of a stale treaty before the Senate still serves national interests, the treaty letter of transmittal and submission should be updated for current circumstances. The Secretary of State must revoke most outstanding C-175 authorities that have been granted to other agencies during previous administration, although such revocation should be closely coordinated with the White House for logistical reasons. Coordinate with other agencies. Interagency engagement in this new environment must be similarly adjusted to mirror presidential direction. Indeed, coordination among federal agencies is challenging even in the most well-oiled administrations. Although such coordination is incapable and sometimes productive, agencies tend to leverage each other's resources in ways that occasionally have off-mission consequences for the agency or agencies with the resources. Ideally, the Secretary of State should work as part of an agile foreign policy team, along with the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, and other agency heads to flesh out and advance the president's foreign policy. Bureaucratic stovepipes of the past should be less important than the commitment to and achievement of the president's foreign policy agenda. The State Department's role in these interagency discussions must reflect the president's clear direction and disallow resources and tools to be used in any way that detracts from the presidential directed mission. Coordinate with Congress. Congress has both the statutory and appropriations authority to impact the State Department's operations and has a strong interest in key aspects of American foreign policy. The department must therefore take particularly care in its interaction with Congress, since poor interactions with Congress, regardless of intentions, could trigger congressionally pushback or have other negative impacts on the president's agenda. This will require particularly strong leadership of the Department of State's Bureau of Legislative Affairs. The Secretary of State and political leadership should ensure full coordination with the White House regarding congressional engagement on any State Department responsibility. This may lead to, for example, the president authorizing the State Department to engage with members of Congress in relevant committees on certain issues, including statutory designated congressional consultations, but to remain radio silent on volatile or designated issues on which the White House wants to be the primary or only voice. All such by political appointees in conjunction with career officials who have the relevant expertise and are all willing to work in concert with the president's political appointees on particular sensitive matters. Respond vigorously to the Chinese threat. The State Department recently opened the Office of China Coordination, or China House. This office intended to bring together experts inside and outside the State Department to coordinate U.S. government relations with China and advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system. Whether China House will streamline U.S. government communication, consensus, and action on China policy, given the presence of other agencies with strong competing or adverse interests, remains to be seen. The unit is dependent on adequate and competent staff being assigned by other bureaus within the State Department. Nonetheless, the concept is one a Republican administration should support mutatis mutandis. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has been at war with the US for decades. Now that this is reality has been accepted throughout the government, the State Department must be prepared to lead the US diplomatic effort accordingly. The centralization of efforts in one place is critical to this end. Review immigration and domestic security requirements. Arguably, the department's most noteworthy challenge on the global stage has been its handling of immigration and domestic security issues, which are inextricably related. The State Department's apparent posture toward these two issues, which are of paramount importance to the American people, has historically been that they are lesser importance than other issues, and that they can be treated as concessions in broader diplomatic engagements. In other instances in which access to the U.S. in the form of immigrant permanent and non-immigrant temporary visas could potentially serve as a diplomatic leverage, it is almost never used. To some degree, the State Department and many of its personnel appear to view the U.S. immigration system less as a tool for strengthening the United States and more as a global welfare program. To ensure the safety, security, and prosperity of all Americans, this must change. Below are several key areas in which the department's formal and informal postures must adjust to reflect the current immigration and domestic security environment. Visa reciprocity. The United States should strictly enforce the doctrine of reciprocity when issuing visas to all foreign nationals. For too long, the U.S. has provided virtually unfettered access to foreign nationals from countries that do not respond in kind, including countries that are actively hostile to U.S. interests and nationals. Mandatory reciprocity will convey the necessary reality that other countries do not have an unfettered right to U.S. access and must reciprocally offer variable visa-based access to U.S. nationals. The State Department's reaction time to other countries' changes in visa policies with respect to the U.S. must be streamlined to ensure it can be updated in real time. Section 243D, visa sanctions. Visa sanctions under Section 243D of the Immigration Nationality Act, INA, enacted into law to motivate countries to accept the return of any nationals who have been ordered removed from the U.S., should be quickly and fully enforced. Recalcitrant countries that do not accept receipt of their returned nationals will risk the suspension of the issuance of all immigrant visas and all non-immigrant visas or all visas. These country-specific sanctions should remain in place until the sanctioned country accepts the return of all its removal pending nationals and formally commits to future regular acceptance of its nationals. Black letter implementation of this law will demonstrate a heretofore lacking seriousness to the international community that other nations must respect U.S. immigration laws and work with federal authorities to accept returning nationals or lose access to the United States. Right-sizing refugee admissions. The Biden administration has engineered what is nothing short of a collapse of U.S. border security and interior immigration enforcement. This administration's humanitarian crisis, which is arguably the greatest humanitarian crisis in the modern era, which has harmed Americans and foreign nationals alike, will take many years and billions of dollars to fully address. One casualty of the Biden administration's behavior will be the current form of the U.S. refugee admission program. The federal government's obligation to shift national security, essential screening, and vetting resources to forge border crisis will necessitate an indefinite curtailment of the number of U.S. RAP refugee admissions. The State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, which administers USRAP, must shift its resources to challenges stemming from the current immigration situation until the crisis can be contained and refugee-focused screening and vetting capacity can reasonably be restored. Strengthening bilateral and multilateral immigration-focused agreements. Restoration of both domestic security and the integrity of the U.S. immigration system should start with rapid reactivation of several key initiatives in effect at the conclusion of the Trump administration. Re-implementation of the Remain in Mexico policy, safe third country agreements, and other measures to address the influx of non-Mexican asylum applicants at the United States-Mexico border must be day one priorities. Although the State Department must rein in the C-175 authorities of other agencies, the Department of Homeland Security should retain or regain C-175 authorities for negotiating bilateral and multilateral security agreements. Evolution of national security vulnerable visa programs. To protect the American people, the State Department, in coordination with the White House and the other focused agencies, should evaluate several key security-sensitive visa programs that it manages. Key programs include, but should not be limited to, the visa program, the F student visa program, and J exchange visa program. The State Department's valuation must ensure that these programs are not only consistent with White House immigration policy, but also aligned with the national security obligations and resource limitations. Pivoting abroad. Personnel and management adjustments are crucial preludes to refocus the State Department's mission, which is implementing the president's foreign policy agenda, and in doing so, ensuring that the interests of American citizens are given priority. That said, the next president must significantly reorient the U.S. government's posture toward friends and adversaries alike, which will include much more honest assessments about who are friends and who are not. This reorientation could represent the most significant shift in core foreign policy principles and corresponding actions since the end of the Cold War. Page 179 and page 212 out of 922 of the PDF. So we're reading Project 2025 Mandate for Leadership, Department of State. Although not every country or issue area can be discussed in this chapter, below are examples of several areas in which a shift in U.S. foreign policy is not only important, but arguably essential. The point is not to assert that everyone in the evolving conservative movement, or in some cases, the growing bipartisan consensus, will agree with the details of this assessment. Rather, what is presented below demonstrates the urgency of these issues and demonstrates and provides a general roadmap for analysis. In a world on fire, a handful of nations require heightened attention. Some represent essential threats to the safety and security of the American people. Others threaten to hurt the U.S. economy, and others are wild cards whose full threat scope is unknown, but nonetheless unsettling. The 5 countries on which the next administration should focus his attention and energy are China, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and North Korea. The People's Republic of China. The designs of the People's Republic of China, PRC, and the Chinese Communist Party, which runs the PRC, are serious and dangerous. This tyrannical country with a population of more than 1 billion people has the vision, resources, and patience to achieve its objectives. Protecting the United States from the PRC's design requires an unambiguous offensive-defensive mix, including protecting American citizens and their interests, as well as U.S. allies from PRC attacks and abuse that undermine U.S. competitiveness, security, and prosperity. The United States must have a cost-imposing strategic response to make Beijing's aggression unaffordable, even as the American economy and U.S. power grow. This stance will require real, sustained, near unprecedented U.S. growth, stronger partnerships, synchronized economic and security policies, and American energy independence. But above all, will require a very honest perspective above the nature and designs of the PRC as more of a threat than a competitor. The next president should use the State Department as its array of resources to reassess and lead this effort, just as it did during the Cold War. The U.S. government needs an Article 10 for China, and it should be a presidential mandate. Along with the National Security Council, the State Department should draft an Article 10, which should be a deeply philosophical look at the China challenge. Many foreign policy professionals and national leaders, both in government and the private sector, are reluctant to take decisive action regarding China. Many are vested in an unshakable faith in the international system and global norms. They are so enamored with them that they cannot brook any criticism or reforms, let alone acknowledge their potential for being abused by the PRC. Others refuse to acknowledge Beijing's malign activities and often pass off criticism as conspiracy theories. For instance, many were quick to dismiss even the possibility that COVID-19 escaped from a Chinese research laboratory. The reality, however, is that the PRC's actions often do sound like conspiracy theories because they are conspiracies. In addition, some knowingly or not parrot the communist line. Global leaders, including President Joe Biden, have tried to normalize or even laud Chinese behavior. In some cases, these voices, like the global corporate giants BlackRock and Disney, directly benefit from doing business with Beijing. On the other hand, others acknowledge the dangers posed by the PRC, but believe in a moderating approach to accommodate its rise, a policy of compete where we must, but cooperate where we can. Including on issues like climate change, this strategy has demonstrably failed. As with all global struggles with communists and other tyrannical regimes, the issue should never be with the Chinese people, but with the communist dictatorship that oppresses them and threatens the well being of nations across the globe. That said, the nation of Chinese power today is the product of history, ideology, and the institutions that have governed China during the course of 5 millennia, inherited by the present Chinese leaders from the preceding generations of the CCP. In short, the PRC challenge is rooted in China's strategic culture and not just the Marxism, Leninism of the CCP, meaning that the internal culture and civil society will never deliver a more normative nation. The PRC's aggressive behavior can only be curbed through the external pressure. The Islamic Republic of Iran. The ongoing protests in the Islamic Republic of Iran, which are widely viewed as a new revolution, have shown that the Islamic regime, which has been in power since 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini became the leader, is at its weakest state in its history and is at odds not only with its own people, but also its regional neighbors. Iran is home to proud and ancient culture, yet its people have struggled to achieve democracy and have had to endure a hostile theocratic regime that vehemently opposes freedom. The time may be right to press harder on the Iranian theocracy, support the Iranian people, and take other steps to draw Iran into the community of free and modern nations. Unfortunately, the Obama and Biden administrations have propped up the brutal Islamist theocracy that has hurt the Iranian people and threatened nuclear war. For example, the Obama administration's 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly referred to as the Iran nuclear deal, gave the Islamic regime a crucial monetary lifeline after the Green Movement protests in 2009, which, while ultimately unsuccessful, did succeed in weakening the regime and showing the world that younger Iranians want freedom. Instead of pressuring the Iranian theocracy to move towards democracy, the Obama administration threw the brutal regime an economic lifeline by giving hundreds of billions of dollars to the Iranian government and providing other sanctions relief. This economic relief did not moderate the regime, but emboldened its brutality, its efforts to expand its nuclear weapons programs, and its support for global terrorism. Former President Obama has admitted his lack of support for the Green Movement during his administration was an error and blamed it on poor advisors. Yet those same advisors are also involved with the Biden administration's insistence on reducing pressure on the theocracy and pressuring a nuclear deal. The next administration should neither preserve nor repeat the mistakes of the Obama and Biden administrations. The correct future policy for Iran is one that acknowledges that it is in a U.S. national security interest, the Iranian people's human rights interests, and a broader global interest in peace and stability for the Iranian people to have the democratic government they demand. This decision to be free of the country's abusive leaders must, of course, be made by the Iranian people, but the United States can utilize its own and others' economic and diplomatic tools to ease the path toward a free Iran and a renewed relationship with the Iranian people. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Once a model of democracy and a true U.S. ally, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has all but collapsed under the communist regimes of the late Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. In the 24 years since Hugo Chavez was first elected Venezuelan president in 1999, the country has violently cracked down on pro-democracy citizens and organizations, shattered its once oil-rich economy, empowered domestic criminal cartels, and helped fuel a hemispheric refugee crisis. Venezuela has swung from being one of the most prosperous, if not the most prosperous country in South America, to being one of the poorest. Its communist leadership has also drawn closer to some of the United States' greatest international foes, including the PRC and Iran, which have long sought a foothold in the Americas. Indeed, Venezuela serves as a reminder of just how fragile democratic institutions that are not maintained can be. To contain Venezuela's communism and aid international partners, the next administration must take important steps to put Venezuela's communist abusers on notice while making strides to help the Venezuelan people. The next administration must work to unite the hemisphere against a significant but underestimated threat in the southern hemisphere: Russia. One issue today that starkly divides conservatives is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The common ground seems to be recognition that presidential leadership in 2025 must chart the course. One school of conservative thought holds that as Moscow's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine drags on, Russia presents major challenges to U.S. interests, as well as to peace, stability, and the post-Cold War security order in Europe. This viewpoint argues for continued U.S. involvement, including military aid, economic aid, and the presence of NATO and U.S. troops if necessary. The end goal of the conflict must be the defeat of Russian President Vladimir Putin and a return to pre-invasion border lines. Another school of conservative thought denies that U.S.-Ukrainian support is in the national security interests of America at all. Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance and is one of the most corrupt nations in the region. Excuse me. European nations directly affected by the conflict should aid in the defense of Ukraine, but the U.S. should not continue its involvement. This viewpoint desires a swift end to the conflict through a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. The tension between these competing positions have given rise to a third approach. This conservative viewpoint eschews both isolationism and interventionism. Rather, each foreign policy decision must first ask the question, what is in the interest of the American people? U.S. military engagement must clearly fall within U.S. interests, be fiscally responsible, and protect American freedom, liberty, and sovereignty, all while recognizing communist China as the greatest threat to U.S. interests. Thus, with respect to Ukraine, continued U.S. involvement must be fully paid for. Limited to military aid, while European allies address Ukraine's economic needs, and have a clearly defined national security strategy that does not risk American lives. Regardless of viewpoints, all sides agree that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is unjust and that the Ukrainian people have a right to defend their homeland. Furthermore, the conflict has severely weakened Putin's military strength and provided a boost to NATO unity and its importance to European nations. The next conservative president has a opportunity to bring resolution to the foreign policy tensions within the movement and chart a new path forward that recognizes communist China as a defining threat to U.S. interests in the 21st century. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Peace and stability in Northeast Asia are vital interests of the United States. The Republic of Korea, South Korea, and Japan are critical allies for ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific. They are indispensable military, economic, diplomatic, and technology partners. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, or North Korea must be deterred from military conflict. The United States cannot permit the DPRK to remain a de facto nuclear power with the capacity to threaten the United States or its allies. This interest is both critical to the defense of the American homeland and the future of global nonproliferation. The DPRK must not be permitted to profit from its blatant violations of international commitments or to threaten other nations with nuclear blackmail. Both interests can only be served if the US disallows the DPRK's rogue regime behavior. Other international engagements. Western Hemisphere. The United States has a vested interest in a relatively united and economically prosperous Western Hemisphere. Nonetheless, the region now has an overwhelming number of socialist or progressive regimes which are at odds with the freedom and growth oriented policies of the US and other neighbors who are increasingly pose hemispheric security threats. A new approach is therefore needed, one that simultaneously allows the US to reposture in its best interest and helps regional partners enter a new century of growth and opportunity. The following core policies must be part of this new direction. A. Sovereign Mexico policy. Mexico is currently a national security disaster. Bluntly stated, Mexico can no longer qualify as a first world nation. It has functionally lost its sovereignty to muscular criminal cartels that effectively run the country. The current dynamic is not good for either US citizens or Mexicans, and the perfect storm created by this cartel state has negative effects that are damaging the entire hemisphere. The next administration must both adopt a posture that calls for a fully sovereign Mexico and take all steps at its disposal to support that result in as rapid a fashion as possible. A fentanyl-free frontier. The same cartels that parasitically run Mexico are working with the PRC to fuel largest drug crisis in the history of North America. These Mexican cartels are working closely with Chinese fentanyl precursor chemical manufacturers, importing those precursor chemicals into Mexico, manufacturing fentanyl onto Mexican soil, and shipping it into the United States and elsewhere. The highly potent narcotic is having an unprecedented lethal impact on the American citizenry. The next administration must leverage its new insistence on a sovereign Mexico and work with other Western Hemisphere partners to halt the fentanyl crisis and put a decisive end to this unprecedented public health threat. A hemisphere-centered approach to industry and energy. The next administration has a golden opportunity to make key economic changes that will not only provide tremendous economic opportunities for Americans, but will also serve as an economic boom to the entire Western Hemisphere. First, the United States must do everything possible with both resources and messaging to shift global manufacturing and industry from more distant points around the globe, especially from the increasingly hostile and human rights abusing PRC to Central and South American countries. Re-hemisphering manufacturing and industry closer to home will not only eliminate some of the more recent supply chain issues that damage the US economy, but will also represent a significant economic improvement for parts of the Americas in need of growth and stabilization. Similarly, the United States must work with Mexico, Canada, and other countries to develop a hemisphere-focused energy policy that will reduce reliance on distant and manipulable sources of fossil fuels, restore the free flow of energy among the hemisphere's largest producers, and work together to increase production, including for nations that are looking for dramatic economic expansion. A local approach to security threats. Western Hemisphere nations, including those in the Caribbean, arguably have stronger cultural and historical ties to the United States than most other countries and regions in the world. Yet Central and South America are moving rapidly into the sphere of anti-American external state actors, including the PRC, Iran, and Russia. Specific countries in the Americas, such as Venezuela, Colombia, Guyana, and Ecuador, are either increasingly in regional security threats in their own rights or are vulnerable to hostile extracontinental powers. And the US has an opportunity to lead these democratic neighbors to fight against the external pressure of threats from abroad and address local regional security concerns. This leadership and collaboration must span all tools at the disposal of US allies and partners, including security-focused cooperation. Middle East and North Africa. The next administration must re-engage with Middle Eastern and North African nations and not abandon the region. Without US leadership, the region may tumble further into chaos or fall prey to American adversaries. This recommendation requires a multidimensional strategy. First, the US must prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear technology and deliver capabilities and more broadly block Iranian ambitions. This means inter alia, reinstituting and expanding Trump administration sanctions, providing security assistance for regional partners, supporting through public diplomacy, and otherwise freedom-seeking Iranian people in their revolt against the mullahs, and ensuring Israel has both the military means and the political support and flexibility to take what it deems to be appropriate measures to defend itself against the Iranian regime and its regional proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Second, the next administration should build on the Trump administration's diplomatic successes by encouraging other Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, to enter the Abraham Accords. Related policies should include reversing the Biden administration's degradation of the long-standing partnership with Saudi Arabia. The Palestinian Authority should be defunded. A further key priority is keeping Turkey in the Western fold in NATO and a NATO ally. This includes a vigorous outreach to Turkey to dissuade it from hedging towards Russia or China, which is likely to require a rethinking of US support for YPG, PKK, People's Protection Units, Kurdistan Workers' Party, Kurdish forces, which Ankara believes are an existential threat to its security. For the foreseeable future and much longer than the one new administration, Middle Eastern oil will play a key role in the world economy. Therefore, the United States must continue to support its allies and compete with its economic adversaries, including China. Relations with Saudi Arabia should be strengthened in a way that seriously curtails Chinese influence in Rwanda. Third, it is in the U.S. national interest to build a Middle East security pact that includes Israel, Egypt, the Gulf states, and potentially India as a second Quad arrangement. Protecting freedom of navigation in the Gulf and in the Red Sea, Suez Canal, is vital to the world economy and therefore to U.S. prosperity as well. In North Africa, security cooperation with European allies, especially France, will be vital to limit growing Islamist threats and the incursion of Russian influence through positionings of the Wagner Group. The U.S. cannot neglect the concern for human rights and minority rights, which must be balanced with strategic and security considerations. Special attention must be paid to challenges religious freedom, especially the status of Middle Eastern Christians and other religious minorities, as well as the human trafficking endemic to the region. Sub-Saharan Africa. Africa's importance to U.S. foreign policy and strategic interests is rising and will only continue to grow. Its explosive population growth, large reserves of industry dependent minerals, proximity to key maritime shipping routes, and its collective diplomatic power ensure the continent's global importance. Yet, as Africa's strategic significance has grown, the US's relative influence there has declined. Terrorist activity on the continent has increased, while America's competitors are making significant gains for their own national interests. The PRC's companies dominate the African supply chain for certain minerals critical to emerging technologies. African nations comprise major country bloc elements that shield the PRC and Russia from international isolation for their rights abuses. And African nations staunchly support PRC foreign policy goals on issues such as Hong Kong occupation, South China Seas dispute arbitration, and Taiwan. The new administration can correct this strategic failing of existing policy by prioritizing Africa and by undertaking fundamental changes in how the United States works with African nations. At a bare minimum, the next administration should shift strategic focus from assistance to growth, reorient the focus of U.S. overseas development assistance away from standalone humanitarian development aid and toward fostering free market system in African countries by incentivizing and facilitating U.S. private sector engagement in these countries. Development aid alone does little to develop countries and can fuel corruption and violent conflicts. While the United States should always be willing to offer emergency and humanitarian relief, both U.S. and African long-term interests are better served by a free market-based, private growth-focused strategy to Africa's economic challenges. Countermanding Chinese activity on the continent. This should include the development of powerful public diplomacy efforts to counter Chinese influence campaigns with commitments to freedom of speech and the free flow of information. The creation of a template digital hygiene program that African countries can assess to sanitize and protect their sensitive communications networks from espionage by the PRC and other hostile actors. The recognition of Somaliland statehood as a hedge against the U.S. deteriorating position in Djibouti, and a focus on supporting American companies involved in industries important to U.S. national interests or that have a competitive advantage in Africa. Counter the furtherance of terrorism. African country-based terrorist groups like Boko Haram may currently lack the capability to attack the United States, but at least some of them would eventually try, if allowed, to consolidate their operations and plan such attacks. The immediate threat they pose lies in their abilities and willingness to strike American targets in their regions of operation or to harm U.S. interests in other ways. The U.S. should support capable African military and security operations through the State Department and other federal agencies responsible for granting foreign military education, training, and security assistance. Build a coalition of the cooperative. Rather than thinning limited federal resources by spreading funds across all countries, including some that are unsupportive or even hostile in the United States, the administration should focus on those countries with which the U.S. can expect a mutually beneficial relationship. After being designated focus countries by the State Department, such nations should receive a full suite of American engagement. That said, the next administration should still maintain a baseline level of contact, even with those countries with which it has less than fruitful relationships, in order to encourage positive developments and to be in position to seize unexpected diplomatic opportunities as they rise. Focus on core diplomatic activities and stop promoting policies birthed in the American culture wars. African nations are particularly and reasonably non-receptive to the U.S. social policies, such as abortion, pro-LGBT initiatives being imposed on them. The United States should focus on core security, economic, and human rights engagements with African partners and reject the promotion of divisive policies that hurt the deepening of shared goals between the US and its African partners. Europe. American foreign policy has long benefited from cooperation with the countries of Europe, generally the EU, and any conservative administration should build on this resource. Yet, the transatlantic relationship is complex with security, trade, and political dimensions. First, the Europe, Eurasia, and Russia region is made up of relatively wealthy and technologically advanced societies that should be expected to bear a fair share of both security needs and global social architecture. The United States cannot be expected to provide a defense umbrella for countries unwilling to contribute appropriately. At stake after 2024 will be examining the status of the Wales Pledge appropriately. At stake after 2024 will be examining the status of the Wales Pledge of 2% of gross domestic product toward defense by NATO members. The new administration will also want to encourage nations to exceed that pledge. Second, transatlantic trade is a significant part of the global economy, and it is in the U.S. national interest to amplify it, especially because this means weaning Europe off its dependence on China. However, there are also transatlantic trade tensions that disturb the US EU relationship and that have had evident across administrations. The US must undertake a comprehensive review of trade arrangements between the EU and the United States to assure that US businesses are treated fairly and to build productive reciprocity. Outside the EU trade, will the post-Beirut UK needs urgent development before London slips back into the orbit of the EU. Third, in the wake of Brexit, EU foreign policy now takes place without UK input, which disadvantages the United States, given that the UK has historically been aligned with many US positions. Therefore, US diplomacy must be more attentive to inner EU developments, while also developing new allies inside the EU, especially the Central European countries on the eastern flank of the EU, which are the most vulnerable to Russian aggression. South and Central Asia. Many key American interests and responsibilities are found in South and Central Asia, specifically continuing to advance the bilateral relationship with India to mutual benefit is a crucial objective for US policy. India plays a crucial role in countering the Chinese threat and securing a free and open Indo-Pacific. It is a critical security guarantor for the key routes of air and sea travel linking East and West, and an important emerging US economic partner. For instance, the 2019 Department of Defense Indo-Pacific Strategy Report noted that the Indian Ocean area is at the nexus of global trade and commerce, with nearly half of the world's 90,000 commercial vessels and two-thirds of global oil trade traveling through its sea lanes. The region boasts some of the fastest growing economies on Earth. Meanwhile, the threat of transnational terrorism remains acute. The humiliating withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan after a 20-year military campaign has created new challenges. It has provided an opportunity to reset the deeply troubled US-Pakistani relationship and reassess US counterterrorism strategy in the region. The long-standing India-Pakistan rivalry and tensions regarding the disputed territory of Kashmir continue to pose risks to regional stability, especially because both countries are nuclear powers. The State Department's role in strengthening the regional security and economic framework linking the US and India is crucial. In addition, the department has important functional responsibilities in dealing with a range of threats from nuclear proliferation to transnational proliferation. While American statecraft should seek to improve bilateral relations throughout the region, U.S. policy must be clear-eyed and realistic about the perfidousness of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and the military political rule in Pakistan. There can be no exception of normal relation with either. The priority for statecraft is advancing the U.S. Indian role as a cornerstone of the Quad, a cooperative framework including the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. The Quad is comprised of the key nations and coordinating efforts for free and open Indo-Pacific. It is an overarching group that nests the key U.S. bilateral and trilateral cooperative efforts that facilitate U.S. collaborative efforts across the Indo-Pacific. The State Department should also encourage the Quad Plus concept that allows other regional powers to participate in Quad coordination on issues of mutual interest. Further, the State Department must support an integrated federal effort to deliver a revamped regional strategy for South Asia, as well as leading the execution of key tasks to implement the strategy. The Arctic. Because of Alaska, the U.S. is an Arctic nation. The Arctic is a vast expanse of land and sea rich in resources, including fish, minerals, and energy. For example, the region is estimated to contain 90 million barrels of oil and 1/4 of the world's undiscovered natural gas reserves. The Arctic is lightly populated. Only 4 million people in the world live above the Arctic Circle, with more than half of those living in Russia. Only around 68,000 people in Alaska live above the Arctic Circle. However, the sheer immensity of the Alaskan Arctic means its population density is less than one person per square mile. The United States has several strong interests in the Arctic region. The rates of melting ice during summer months has led to increased interest not only from shipping and tourism sectors, but also from America's global competitors who are interested in exploiting the region's strategic importance and accessing its bounty of natural resources. In the not too distant future, there will be a growing interest in the Arctic from both state and non state actors alike. China has been open about its interest in the region, primarily as a highway for trade, but also for its rich natural resources. While the PRC's increasing intervention into Arctic affairs is a bit strained because it does not have an Arctic coastline, Russia does, and Russia also has made no secret of its view that the Arctic is vital for economic and military reasons. Russia has invested heavily in new and refurbished Arctic bases and cold weather equipment and capabilities. The North Star of U.S. Arctic policy should remain national sovereignty, safeguarded through robust capabilities as well as through diplomatic, economic, and legal attentiveness. The next administration should embrace the view that NATO must acknowledge that it is, in part, an Arctic alliance, with the likely ascension of Finland and Sweden to NATO. Every Arctic nation, except for Russia, will be a NATO member state. NATO has been slow to appreciate that the Arctic is a theater that it must defend, especially considering Russia's brazen aggression against Ukraine. NATO must develop and implement an Arctic strategy that recognizes the importance of the region and ensures that the Russian use of Arctic waters and resources does not exceed a reasonable footprint. The U.S. should unapologetically pursue American interests in the Arctic by promoting economic freedom in the region. Economic freedom spurs prosperity, innovation, respect for the rule of law, jobs, and sustainability. Most important, economic freedoms can help to keep the Arctic stable, secure. The U.S. should work to ensure that shipping lanes in the Arctic remains available to all global commercial traffic and free onerous fees and burdensome administrative, regulatory, and military requirements. While this should be the next administration policy with respect to all countries that might seek to block free-flowing commercial traffic, the next administration will clearly have to exert substantial attention toward Russia. Both the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy are vital tools to ensure an unmonopolized Arctic. It is imperative that the Navy and Coast Guard continue to expand their fleets, including planned icebreaker acquisitions, to assure Arctic access for the United States and other friendly actors. The remote and harsh conditions of the Arctic also make unmanned systems investment and use particularly appealing for providing additional situational awareness, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The Coast Guard also consider upgrading facilities such as its Barrow Station to reinforce Arctic capabilities and demonstrate a greater commitment to the region. The People's Republic of China has declared a near Arctic state, which is an imaginary term non-existent in an international discourse. The United States should work with like-minded Arctic nations, including Russia, to raise legitimate concerns about the PRC's so-called Polar Silk Road ambitions. Concerning Greenland, the opening of a U.S. consulate in Nunavut is welcome. A formal year-round diplomatic presence is an effective way for the U.S. to better understand local political and economic dynamics. Furthermore, given Greenland's geographic proximity and economic dynamic and its rising potential as a commercial and tourist location, the next administration should pursue policies that enhance economic ties between U.S. and Greenland. International organizations. Defending and protecting the American people and advancing their interests requires the United States to engage in a broad spectrum of bilateral and multilateral relationships, including participating in international organizations, working with other governments through international organizations like the United Nations, UN, can be tremendously useful, but membership in these organizations must also be understood as a means to attain defined goals rather than an end in itself. Engagement with an international organization is one relatively way for the U.S. to defend its interests and to seek to address problems in concert with other nations. But it's not the only option, and American diplomats should be clear-eyed about international organization strengths and weaknesses. When such institutions act against U.S. interests, the United States must be prepared to take appropriate steps in response up to and including withdrawal. The manifest failure and corruption of the World Health Organization, WHO, during the COVID-19 pandemic is an example of the danger that international organizations pose to U.S. citizens and interests. In the next administration must end blind support for international organizations. And an international organization is effective and advances American interests, the United States should support it. If an international organization is ineffective or does not support American interests, the United States should not support it. Those that are effective will still require constant pressure from U.S. officials to ensure that they remain effective. Serious consideration should also be given to withdraw from organizations that no longer have value, quietly undermine U.S. interests or goals, or disproportionately rely on U.S. financial contributions to survive. The Trump administration's tough love approach to international organizations served American interests. For example, the Trump administration withdrew from or terminated funding for the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, and the WHO. The results were a redeployment of taxpayer dollars to better uses in other organizations, getting the message that the United States will not allow itself and its money to be used to undermine its own interests. The Biden administration reversed many of these decisions. Currently, U.S. funding for international organizations is more than $16 billion in fiscal year 2021, a sharp increase from $10.8 billion in fiscal year 2015. Millions of American taxpayer dollars go to support policies and initiatives that hurt the United States and American citizens. The next administration should direct the Secretary of State to initiate a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis of U.S. participation in all international organizations. This review should take into account long-standing provisions in federal law that prohibit the use of taxpayer dollars to promote abortion, population control, and terrorist activities, as well as other applicable restrictions on funding for international organizations and agencies with a view to withholding U.S. funds in case of abuses. International organizations should not be used to promote radical social policies as if they were human rights priorities. Doing so undermines actual human rights and weakens U.S. credibility abroad. The next administration should use its voice, influence votes, and funding in international organizations to promote authentic human rights and respect for sovereignty based on the binding international obligations contained in treaties that have been constitutionally ratified by the U.S. government. It must promote a strict text-based interpretation of treaty obligations that does not consider human rights treaties as living instruments, both within the State Department and within international organizations that receive U.S. funding, including by making respect for sovereignty and authentic human rights a litmus test of personnel decisions and elections processes within international organizations. The U.S. Commission on Unalienable Human Rights focused on the primacy of civil and political rights in its inaugural report, which remains an important guidepost for bilateral and multilateral engagements on human rights. The Commission's report is a roadmap for revamping and re-energizing U.S. human rights policy and should be the basis for both structural and policy changes throughout the State Department. All U.S. multilateral engagements must be reevaluated in light of the work of the Commission, and initiatives that promote controversial policies must be halted and rolled back. It is paramount to create a healthy culture of respect for life, the family, sovereignty, and authentic human rights in international organizations and agencies. To support this goal, the U.S. led an effort during the Trump administration to forge a consensus among like-minded countries in support of human life, women's health, support of the family as the basic unit of human society, and defense of national sovereignty. The result was the Geneva Consensus Declaration on Women's Health and Protection of the Family. All U.S. foreign policy engagements that were produced and expanded under the Obama and Biden administration must be aligned with the Geneva Consensus Declaration and the work of the U.S. Commission on Unalienable Human Rights. The U.S. government should not and cannot promote or fund abortion in international programs or multilateral organizations. Technically, the United States can prevent its international funding from going toward abortions, but the U.S. will have a greater impact by including like-minded nations and building on the coalition launched through the Geneva Consensus Declaration with a view to shaping the work of international agencies by functioning as a united front. The COVID-19 pandemic made it painfully clear that both international organizations and some countries are only too willing to trample human rights in the name of public health. For example, the WHO was and remains willing to support the suppression of its close For example, the WHO was and remains willing to support the suppression of basic human rights, partially because of its close relationship with human rights abusers like the PRC. The next administration should unequivocally embrace the premise that humanity and the international community can simultaneously tackle pandemics and other emerging health threats without impeding the rights of people. It must also become a vocal surrogate for people in countries where rights are being suppressed in the name of health. This will likely require greater restrictions on the supply of federal dollars to the WHO and other health-focused international organizations, pending adjustments of their policies. The United States must return to the treating international organizations as vehicles for promoting American interests or taking steps to extract itself from those organizations. So when we come back from break, we will pick up on page 192. You know what? No, let me go ahead. Nope. Shaping the future. We only have to go to 197. Let's go. So, but I do have to take a short break for my 4:30 check-in. But we're gonna go ahead and finish, and then we're gonna take an hour break, and then we're gonna come back. Shaping the future. Development of a grand foreign policy strategy is key to the next administration's success. But without addressing structural and related issues of the State Department, this strategy will be at risk. The I'm going to take a group of no, we'll stop. We'll stop here. My last break, I had the honor of Unica Gaines giving me a call watching Wimbledon. Coco won. Yay. She's going to the next level. And so going to the US Open was one of the beautiful things, playing tennis. And now Coco Golf being on the radar for travel experiences with Wimbledon. And the Wimbledon being about 3 weeks long, but just really wanting to go to the last week. So on the radar for next year, and talking to Unica Gaines about the building of this July 11th event. So excited. So we had 2 hours in here, and we're going to take an hour break, and then we're going to come back. Thank you so much, Deandra. You're thinking of digger deeper into Project 2025. I'm glad you found the videos. Inderpreet, thank you so much for the actual comment. And thank you, Jeff Taylor, for the comment. And thank you so much, Unica Gaines, for being the angel of Adriane Mays' life, day 60, just a celebration of the billionaire journey. And just excited too. Wimbledon 2025, I see it. And but just understanding the rules and the nature. So we'll be right back with you in about an hour. I can, I will, I must. Let's go. Deuces.